Shabbat Shalom. Today's message is called Standing in the Gap Together, and it comes from, more or less, from the Haftarah, the portion of the prophets of Achremot Kedoshim, and we're going to be speaking today mostly, but not entirely, about or connected to Ezekiel chapter 22. Now, some of you may remember the 1982 film called An Officer and a Gentleman. It was with Richard Gere as officer candidate Zach Mayo and Louis Gossett Jr. as Marine Corps Gunnery Sergeant Foley, the drill instructor. On the first day of the school, Sergeant Foley tells his new class this. He says, "I will use every means necessary, fair and unfair, to trip you up, to expose your weaknesses as a potential aviator." Later in the film, he catches candidate Mayo, which is Richard Gere, selling shiny belt buckles and boots to make extra cash. And Sergeant Foley wants Mayo to resign, but Mayo refuses. And what follows is several long days of brutal physical exercises for Mayo to torment him into resigning. And in the end, he begs Sergeant to, saying not to throw him out. And he says he's got nowhere else to go and that he's got nothing else. And the sergeant, through rigorous training, both physical and mental, breaks Mayo down to nothing and then rebuilds him into a man of integrity and character. Mayo graduates as an officer and gentleman, and of the United States Navy, headed to flight school and then jet aircraft training. You don't see that in the film, but that was where it was headed. And kind of in a way, I brought up that movie because it's what I feel God is doing with us. He's breaking us down so that he can rebuild us into better people, men and women of integrity and character, officers in the army of God. Well, what is an officer? Some of us may think we know, some of us may not know. We've heard the term. I'll explain to you what an officer is. An officer is someone with a deep sense of responsibility, a person commissioned to fulfill a duty to their mission, a person with a code of honor, integrity, and character, a person of purpose and commitment, a person with a true loyalty to their commander-in-chief and those officers appointed over him or her. And in our case, as Yeshua believers in God's army, our commander-in-chief is Adonai Tzevaot, the Lord of hosts. We're not just ordinary commissioned officers in the army of God. We're messianics, and as such, we are God's Marines. The Marines have a motto, and it's in Latin, and it reads, Semper Fidelis. Marines say Semper Fi for short. It means always faithful. And our Lord, Messiah Yeshua, the commander of God's armies, expects nothing less of us. We are called to be always faithful. We are Marine officers in the army of God. We are first in and last out. We are God's officers, his lieutenants and his captains, commissioned by Yeshua. And our mission is to show up and stand up for God. And as such, we are to stand in the breach. We stand in the gap. In Ezekiel 22, verse 30, the prophet speaking from God says this. He says, I've searched for someone among them who would build up the wall and stand in the breach. And the word here, breach, is also translated often as gap, stand in the gap. The Hebrew word here in the original text is peretz. It means breach, gap, or bursting forth. In Shakespeare's Henry V, King Henry says this: "Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead. In peace there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger, stiffen the sinews, and summon up the blood." You see, it's a call to stand together, is what King Henry in Shakespeare's play Henry V is saying. It's a call to stand together, to prepare for battle. The king is calling his officers and his men once more into the breach, dear friends. We are God's officers, his Marines. Our mission, again, is to show up and to stand up for God. Quite often, so many in the body of Messiah, they're like part-timers. Sometimes they show up and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they stand together with the congregation and sometimes they don't. What happened to Semper Fidelis? What happened to always faithful? Let me give an example. A man was in his store purchasing some clothing, and the store clerk noticed from his ID that his customer was a rabbi. And the clerk asked the rabbi what synagogue he served at. When the rabbi told him, the man replied, "Oh, really? That's my synagogue." And at this, the rabbi kind of perked up and he said, "That's strange. I've been the rabbi there for about 5 years and I've never seen you before." And the clerk responded, "Come on, Rabbi, I didn't say I was a fanatic." You know, the very first call for every Yeshua believer is to show up, to be there to answer God's call. I mean, that's the first call of every Yeshua believer.
All participants are muted.
And you know, when God says, "Who will go for me?" we're supposed to say, "Hineni, here I am. Send me." We who desire to serve Yeshua must commit ourselves to regular fellowship and worship with God's people, even if the only services are online, on the phone, on a video call. We need to show up and participate and come together and stand in that gap together. Some might say, "I don't get anything out of my congregation." Well, maybe that's because that person is not looking to put anything in to begin with. They have a saying in the military services: you get out of it what you put into it. You get out of the Army what you put into the Army. You get out of the Marines what you put into the Marines, and so on. When we regularly attend services in obedience to God's word, with the desire to serve him, we will certainly find both joy and purpose in our worship experience. We are, after all, God's Marines. We don't do part-time. We don't do sometimes. We are God's Marines. Our God is Semper Fidelis, always faithful, and we are made in his image. He wants us to be like him, always faithful. So we stand in the breach. We stand in the gap. Let's talk about some of the gaps that can be bridged. We're bridging these gaps. You know, there's gaps between teens and adults, men and women, communists and capitalists, heaven and hell. You know, Luke chapter 16, verse 26 says this: between us and you, there is a great gap, a great chasm, and it's firmly set or fixed. Spiritually, there exists a gap between man and God. But here's the good news. And I'm going to get into the big buts about that gap. The gap can be bridged in several ways. First, the gap is bridged by Mashiach, by Messiah. Acts chapter 4, verse 12. There is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. Talking about Yeshua. Also in 1 Timothy 2, verse 5, Paul teaches us that Yeshua is our mediator, another way that of bridging this gap. For there is one God, and there is one mediator between God and man, a human, Messiah Yeshua. And in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 25, it says that Yeshua is our intercessor. Therefore, he is also able to save completely those who draw near to God through him, always living to make intercession for them. Always living to make intercession for us. Also, Hebrews 4, verse 14, Yeshua is our high priest. We have a great Kohen Gadol, high priest, who has passed through the highest heaven, Yeshua, the Son of God. The gap is also bridged by the Ruach, the Spirit. And we are all adopted into the body. 1 Corinthians 12, verse 13 says, for it was by one Spirit that we were all immersed into one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slaves or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink. We are Yeladim Shel Elohim. We are children of God. John 1, verse 12, but whoever did receive him, meaning Yeshua, but whoever did receive him, those trusting in his name, to these he gave the right to become children of God. We are Yeladim Shel Elohim. We are children of God. Also, we are Messiah's spiritual sheep. Another bridge. John 10, verse 27. My sheep hear my voice, Yeshua says. I know them, and they follow me. Number 3, the gap is also bridged by submission. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 13. This will continue until we all come into the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of Ben Elohim, that is the Son of God, to mature adulthood, the measure of the stature of Messiah's fullness. Mature adulthood. Also, we bridge the gap because the younger is to submit to the elder. 1 Peter 5, verse 5. Likewise, you younger ones, submit yourselves to the elders. And all of you, clothe yourselves in humility toward one another, for God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. We bridge the gap knowing that, according to Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1, children are to submit to their parents, not the other way around. Ephesians 6, verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Also, believers are to submit to one another. Ephesians 5, verse 21. Also, submit yourselves to one another out of reverence for God. Number 4, the gap is bridged by suffering. Yes, by suffering. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18. For Messiah once suffered for sins also, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, he made alive by the Ruach, by the Spirit. the suffering of believers. 1 Peter 4, verse 12. Do not be surprised at this fiery ordeal taking place among you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. You see, God is bringing things together and he's filling in the gaps of our lives, the breaches within our lives. He's filling them in. The gaps are also bridged by the scriptures, by the word of God. Ephesians chapter 4, 11 through 12. He himself gave some to be emissaries, some as prophets, some as proclaimers of the good news, and some as shepherds and teachers, to equip the kedoshim, the holy ones, the saints, for the work of service, for building up the body of Messiah. All shepherds are to be equipping the believers. All shepherds are to be equipping the believers and filling in the gaps in their lives. It's part of the job description. The gap is bridged also by prayer. Very important. Acts 2, verse 1. We see it says, when the day of Shavuot, also translated as Pentecost, had come, they were all together in one place. What do you think they were doing? Gathered from all those countries, Jews of all those different countries gathered together in Jerusalem in one place at the same time. What were they doing together? Playing pinochle? No, they were praying. Number 7, the gap is bridged by soul winning. James 5, verse 20. Let him know that the one who turns a sinner from the error of his ways shall save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. A multitude of sins. Number 8, the gap will be bridged by Messiah's return. By Messiah's return. 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 16 and 17 says this, for the Lord himself shall come down from heaven with a commanding shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the blast of God's shofar, and the dead in Messiah shall rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left behind, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we shall always be with the Lord. And in 1 John chapter 3, verse 2, now we are God's children, and it has not yet been revealed what we will be. But we do know that when it's revealed, we shall be like him because we see him just as he is. Here's an illustration of what I'm talking about. A father and his grown son were at odds. They hadn't spoken in years. Both of them remembered the last time they did and the harsh words that had been shared. The wife and mother of the two, the wife and mother, she tried to get them together, attempting to be a mediator and bridge the gap, but to no avail. They were very proud men. They were stubborn. Each wanted the other to apologize first. And it took the hospital deathbed on which the mom eventually would lie to get them into the same room together. But still, they took turns spending time with her while ignoring the other one. In her final moments, as it was clear she was taking her last breaths, the nurses insisted both men come to her bedside for her dying wish. There they were on either side of that bed, and she lie in the middle. The last moments of her life. She asked each of them to take one of her hands, and she held in each one of her hands, one in the other. And when they did, she mustered all the strength she could, and she raised both of them up, holding each one of their hands, one in one of her hands and one hand in the other hand. And she raised them up with all the strength that she could put together. And she said, Lord, I'm ready to go home now. Her eyes closed and her hands fell together across her stomach. Father and son stood there weeping, realizing she was gone. Then they realized their hands were also touching each other. Right there, they swallowed their pride and made things right. The gap was finally taken up. The gap was finally healed. She stood in that gap for them. She put herself in the middle of that breach, even though it was the very last moments of her life. When you look at the Bible, you know, Moses stood in the gap when he interceded for his people. Abraham stood in the gap when he interceded for Sodom and Gomorrah. Yeshua stood in the gap when he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. You see, God expects us. God expects us to stand in the gap today. God expects us to stand boldly in that gap, to stand in that breach together. Question is, are you going to be one of the people, one of the believers, one of the followers of Messiah who will stand in that gap together? Will you stand in there together? You got to realize you are God's Marines. You are God's Marines, God's officers. Yeshua already called you and commissioned you. John 15, verse 16. You did not call me, I have called you and commissioned you, appointed you, anointed you. There's a lot of different ways to see it or translate it, but it's already, Yeshua's already called you, he's already commissioned you. Isn't it really time? Isn't it time? Isn't it finally time that we started being semper fidelis, that we started being always faithful to the God who is forever faithful? And even when we are not faithful, he remains faithful because he cannot deny himself. But he's calling us to be like him, created in his own image. He's calling us to be semper fidelis, to be always faithful. And that means showing up. And it means standing up for God, for one another. As Henry V said in the Shakespeare play, King Henry says, once more into the breach, dear friends. And this should be our attitude. Not, oh, let someone else take care of it. Let someone else do it. Once more into the breach. Sometimes, in these days of very difficult trial, standing in the gap together, standing in the breach together could be as small and simple as to another believer, a family member, whether they're sick or just down, or they live alone, or whatever it is, or you know they're having some issues, or you feel led to contact them, to call them up. Because when you call them up and you talk with them and you encourage them and you cheer them up and you pray with them on the phone, you are standing in the breach. And at the end of that, after you have won them by the power of Yeshua and by the Spirit, once you've won them, then you're both standing together in the breach, like the father and son, that it took the wife and the son's mother's death to hold their hands and bring them together. And God is that one who's holding onto your hands while you're separated from one another. Whether you're separated because of emotional issues, whether you're separated because of an insult, a wrong, whether you're separated because we just can't get together right now because of the restrictions, because of the health concerns, because of the pandemic. But God is holding every one of our hands and pulling them together. Healing that breach, healing that gap once more into the breach, dear friends. Come on, let's stand in the gap together. Semper Fi and Shabbat Shalom. God bless. So don't know how many of